Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at an age-old question in the history of philosophy, and hopefully provide a helpful analysis of the problem itself, and how it applies to contemporary issues that are at the forefront of philosophical discourse. The issue at hand is the Euthyphro dilemma, originating from an eponymous dialogue written by Plato at the start of the 4th century BCE. It supposedly chronicles an event that transpires a few weeks before the trial of Socrates, where he is later condemned to death for corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety against the gods of the state. Our story begins with Socrates, who is hanging around the footsteps of the courthouse of Athens. He encounters Euthyphro, a religious prophet who is on his way to prosecute his father, who had killed a servant by binding his arms in chains and leaving him to die in a ditch. It's a weird and complicated affair, because Euthyphro's family is giving him a hard time. They feel he didn't do anything wrong, and the man he killed had himself killed another citizen of Athens, and they felt that this exempted him from any wrongdoing. The world of antiquity was a messed up place, where philosophers could be executed for annoying the wrong people, but if you straight up murder someone by taking the law into your own hands, you could get off scot-free. Anyways, the important bit is that Socrates notices that Euthyphro looks sure of himself. Since Euthyphro appears so confident, Socrates asks him for some advice. Since he himself is accused of impiety, and Euthyphro himself is an incredibly pious man, Socrates wants to know how he defines piety. This way, when he eventually goes to trial and is forced to answer the charge of impiety, he can use Euthyphro's definition in place of his own. Socrates, however, has a few conditions, and these conditions must be satisfied by Euthyphro's definition of piety. First, it must be universally true. One should be able to hold any action to this definition in order to measure its piety. Secondly, it must express the essence of piety. In other words, it must describe what makes something essentially pious, and how to differentiate between pious and impious actions. Leading up to the dilemma, Euthyphro offers us 3 definitions of piety, all of which will be shot down by Socrates. The third definition, which is where the conversation really begins to take a turn for the worst, is what philosophers have dubbed the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro's first definition is that piety is simply what he's doing now, prosecuting his father for murder. This can be easily thrown out as a definition because it simply gives us an example of piety without telling us what it really is. Socrates presses Euthyphro by asking him once again what makes an action essentially pious, and not just to describe an action that happens to be pious. The second definition offered by Euthyphro is that piety is what is pleasing to the gods. Now, Socrates thinks this is a better definition than the first, because it is defined in a universal form, but he still finds it ultimately untrue. From the Greek pantheistic perspective, there are a large number of gods and therefore widespread disagreement in regard to what pleases them. Given that an act could be both pious and impious under this definition, it must be incorrect, since it violates the law of non-contradiction, which states that 2 contradictory premises cannot be true at the same time. Adjusting his previous definition, Euthyphro claims that piety is what is pleasing to all the gods. This overcomes the previous objection and avoids violating the law of non-contradiction. It seems like all of our problems have been resolved, right? Well, this is not the case, according to Socrates, who asks Euthyphro one more question. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Euthyphro is confused by the question and asks Socrates what exactly he means. In reply, Socrates offers an obtuse and honestly confusing line of reasoning, talking about things that are carried as opposed to being carried. It's pretty obscure, and doesn't really seem to convince Euthyphro of anything. After this, Euthyphro and Socrates exchange a few more definitions, but they both depart in disagreement as to what piety is, which is a pretty good analogy for how most philosophical conversations end. Since we've arrived at the critical section of the dialogue, we should return to Socrates' initial question to see what it actually says. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Euthyphro's definition breaks down into a biconditional claim regarding the relationship between piety and being loved by the gods. Act X is pious if and only if Act X is loved by all the gods. But this biconditional claim is fundamentally ambiguous, and as such has 2 very different interpretations. In each of these definitions, one side of the biconditional explains and grounds the other, and it's not clear which interpretation we ought to accept. On the one hand, if being loved by all the gods grounds an act as being pious, this would seem to make the property of being piety response-dependent. If tomorrow the gods decided that what it meant to be pious was something entirely different, we would simply have to accept this change in the status of piety. On the other hand, if the gods love what they do because it is pious, then we are endorsing a realist construal of piety. In essence, this would make our conception of piety independent, or at least prior to, divine attitudes. However, endorsing this view seems to make the opinion of the gods more or less unimportant. I mean, sure, they can recognize piety when they see it, but they've still failed to identify what makes an act essentially pious. In light of this dilemma, Socrates rejects the response-dependent view, because this would make piety contingent and arbitrary. Instead, he endorses the naturalistic view, claiming that the gods are responsive to the pious features of the world. From this perspective, it is the piousness of individuals and their actions that make them suitable for divine love. Now, philosophers today basically never talk about piety, except perhaps some theologians. So you might wonder why the Euthyphro dilemma is so widely discussed today. Well, the reason is because the dialogue itself doesn't exclusively concern the discussion of piety. As Socrates himself says later in the dialogue, piety and justice are closely related, and questions of justice sharply impinge on questions of morality. In fact, we can substitute the word pious for moral in the dilemma, and it actually produces a claim which is quite controversial and would have gotten Socrates in a lot of trouble with the religious authorities of his day. The claim reads, "Is the moral loved by the gods because it is moral, or is it moral because it is loved by the gods?" Now, this move will be recognizable by those of you who are familiar with the dilemma, but it actually offers a strong argument against the force of divine command theory, the claim that the commands of God determine whether an action is morally right. In the next video, we'll look at divine command theory more closely, and decide whether the Euthyphro dilemma poses a significant problem for the view and others like it. Thanks for watching.